Good morning, everyone. It is Pastor Monica McDougal here of Attica First United Methodist Church in Attica, Indiana, and it is a joy to be with you all this morning, Sunday, August 25th. I have some precarious lighting as the sun is coming up behind the houses across the street there, so my apologies if the lighting gets a little wonky. But this morning my sermon is titled Lifeguard on Duty, and it was inspired by Psalm 130. This morning I will read that psalm from the New International Version, or the NIV. So please join me as we prepare our hearts and minds for worship this morning as we hear these words from the psalmist. Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy. If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that we can with reverence serve you. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning, more than watchmen wait for the morning. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. The word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God. I almost drowned when I was 6 years old. I was at summer camp enjoying my time in our camp swimming pool on a hot July day. I had taken a few swimming lessons, but I was by no means a confident swimmer, so I always stayed in the shallow end of the pool. That day I was doing just that. I was playing in the shallow end of the camp's pool, doing this thing where I would fully submerge myself, crouching down in the water as low as I could go, and then jumping up and out of the water with all the force I could muster. And I was having so much fun that I didn't notice that with each jump, I was inching further and further into the pool's deep end. I went to do another jump, but this time when I came back down, I could no longer touch the bottom of the pool. I remember feeling my stomach drop with fear. Despite my young age, I knew I was in a dangerous situation. I was trying to swim to the ledge of the pool, but my legs were so tired from all of the jumping I had been doing. I tried to yell for help, but it was too loud in the pool for anyone to hear me. I panicked, which, while understandable for a child of my age and situation, that only made things worse, right? As I was bobbing up and down in the water, I kept taking on more and more water into my mouth, and I was sinking further and further. I looked around frantically for help, and I spotted my then 8-year-old brother in a floaty at the end of the pool. He had spotted me, knew I was in trouble, and was frantically trying to swim closer to me. I could tell that he had begun yelling for help too. And then I slipped under the water. And I remember feeling really scared, but then I got so tired that I almost was too tired to be scared anymore. But then I felt arms wrap around my torso, and I was yanked up and out of the water. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the hot concrete pool deck, looking up into the terrified face of a teenage lifeguard who had rescued me. My brother was there too, as well as my camp counselors. Every person looked scared, all the color drained from their faces. Now, luckily, I didn't lose consciousness. The lifeguard didn't have to perform CPR. And while it felt like the whole ordeal lasted hours, it had been less than a minute or two. The lifeguard had done her job. She noticed me and pulled me out of the water in time, and for that, I am eternally grateful. But I think about that day a lot, every time I'm at a pool or a beach. Now, I don't have an unhealthy fear of drowning anymore, where I won't get into the water, but I'm still very nervous about it, and for good reason. According to the Centers for Disease Control, approximately 4,500 people die from drowning in the United States each year. This is an average of 11 fatal drownings per day, plus approximately 8,000 non-fatal drownings per year, which averages out to 22 per day. And drownings have been increasing year after year for a variety of reasons, but the primary causes for this increase is a decrease in affordable and accessible swimming lessons and a lack of trained lifeguards at many beaches and pools. And even if we address that first issue, even if we made swimming lessons affordable and accessible, the presence of lifeguards is essential. The International Lifesavers Federation reports that certified lifeguards rescue over 1 million people per year around the world. Those of you who watched the Summer Olympics this year might know that even Olympic swimmers are monitored by teams of lifeguards while they compete, because even the most highly trained swimmers among us could find themselves needing to be rescued. Now, I know firsthand that when you find yourself in troubled water, the presence of a well-trained, diligent lifeguard can make all of the difference. Now, not everyone on this planet will find themselves in a similar position as I was, struggling to literally keep your head above water in the depths of a pool or a lake or an ocean. However, most of us will experience a different type of drowning, a spiritual kind of drowning. Those are different kinds of depths. One that maybe isn't as immediately dangerous, but still very serious. Perhaps you faced the depths of grief after having lost someone close to you. Or maybe you've had to navigate the depths of uncertainty after job loss or divorce or natural disaster. Some will experience the depths of anger, frustration, depression, anxiety, or hopelessness. These depths are the kind that humans from the beginning of time have faced in their own unique ways. Grief, pain, fear, and worry are not modern experiences. They are tales as old as time. The book of Psalms speaks to these experiences in its beautiful poetry and prose. Now, of course, Psalms is an anthology. It's a collection of Hebrew religious hymns. There are 150 psalms that fall into different genres. There are psalms of praise, psalms of lament, psalms of wisdom, and psalms of pilgrimage, among others. This morning we heard the beautiful words of Psalm 130, which is kind of a combination of two genres. It's considered a psalm of lament or of confession, and also a psalm of pilgrimage. In many Bibles, when you look up Psalm 30, you will see that it opens with the words, a song of ascent. The songs of ascent are Psalms 120 through 134. They are called as such because they were songs recited by the Levites as they ascended the steps to the temple in Jerusalem, and later by Jewish pilgrims making their way into Jerusalem for the festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The fact that this psalm is labeled as a song of ascent is interesting considering how it begins. The psalmist opens Psalm 130 by saying, "Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord." Out of the depths. Now, life is full of ups and downs, of highs and lows, but it is clear that whoever first wrote this psalm was not writing it from one of the ups, one of the high points of life. No, this psalm was born out of the depths. The psalmist is down. Their life is low. But why? Why is the psalmist crying out to God? Well, unlike some of the other similar psalms, Psalm 130 does not appear to have been inspired by the terror and destruction of war or exile or sickness or natural disaster. Instead, we gather from the context of this short psalm that the depths the psalmist is enduring are those spiritual depths I mentioned before. The writer is drowning, feeling dragged underwater by the burden of their own sins. I imagine that the psalmist lies awake at night, unable to sleep, through the constant shame spiral going on in their mind. Every mistake they've ever made, every failure they've ever made, every sin committed, playing on a loop. And perhaps you can empathize with the psalmist on that. I know I can. It's been said before that oftentimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. We humans, we tend to hold on to shame and to guilt until they become heavy iron chains that drag us further and further into the depths of despair. And that's where the psalmist is, at rock bottom, crying out to God. But interestingly, the psalmist's cries for help here do not seem particularly desperate, but rather confident. They're not crying out for a time machine to go back and erase their sins, or a way to wipe their memory to live in blissful ignorance of their past mistakes. The psalmist knows that they are drowning, and they know why. Their sins have led them astray, and now they are out past where their feet can touch, the weight of their guilt and shame dragging them under. No one is more aware of how the psalmist ended up there than the psalmist themselves. But that's not all the psalmist knows. The psalmist also knows that the lifeguard is on duty. That lifeguard, of course, is God, and God is always prepared to rescue us. God will rescue the psalmist out of the depths, not with a life preserver or a jet ski, but with grace and forgiveness. More than that, God doesn't care how many times the same psalmist has had to be pulled out of the depths. As the psalmist writes, "If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness so that we can with reverence serve you." In other words, God doesn't keep score. God doesn't care how deep you've gotten, how far away from shore you've drifted, how you ended up there. God doesn't care how heavy the chains are or how well you can or cannot swim. God's love for us is so big, so infinite, that God's grace knows no bounds. So the psalmist is confident that God will rescue them because that's just who God is. This psalm speaks to the nature of God, that God remains steadfast even in the most troubled of waters. Now, let me be very clear. Just because the psalmist is confident that God, the lifeguard, is on duty, does not mean that the psalmist has no responsibility in this situation. The knowledge of God's grace is not licensed to do whatever we want, to whoever we want, whenever we want. While we have confidence that God will forgive us, that God will rescue us out of the depths, we also know that God calls us to do the work to avoid ending up there in the first place, right? There is a responsibility on our behalf to avoid sinful behavior that leads us further and further into the depths. After my near drowning, I was scared to swim for many years. I would get in pools, but I would always stay at the shallow end as close to the entrance steps as possible. And I wouldn't do that jumping thing that I used to love. As you can imagine, this meant that my time in the pool was not nearly as fun as it had once been. I couldn't fully enjoy my time in the water because I just kept thinking about that time I almost drowned. It didn't matter if a lifeguard was on duty. Sure, I knew that the lifeguard could save me. After all, a lifeguard had saved me that day at camp. But despite my confidence in the lifeguards, I was lacking confidence in myself, right? Sure, if something happened to me, a lifeguard could save me. I didn't want something to happen to me, and I was scared that I wasn't a strong enough swimmer to avoid that situation. But eventually I got tired of not having fun in the pool, so I decided to learn how to swim. I began by teaching myself, working on floating and treading water. I practiced my arm strokes in the bathtub at home before beginning to do laps across the shallow end of a pool. I even worked with a swim lesson instructor as well. And 4 years after that scary day, when I was 10 years old, I was back at summer camp taking the swim test to be able to swim in the deep end for the first time. And I passed. Today, I love being in the water because I have confidence not just that a trained lifeguard is there as a last resort, but also that I'm a strong enough swimmer that I will hopefully avoid needing to be rescued in the first place, or if I still need to be rescued, that I'll be able to stay afloat long enough for that rescue to take place. My friends, we know we can always count on God to show up for us. The psalmist was able to keep treading water out there because they were confident that rescue was on the way. Without that confidence, it would have been much harder for them to stay afloat. So our faith, our trust in God is something that we cannot take for granted. Faith is something that must be practiced in order to be strengthened and maintained. So it makes sense then why this psalm is such an important part of ancient pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem. Pilgrimages are, of course, important spiritual practices in many different faiths. It's where adherents of a faith travel to important sites in the history and tradition of their faith to worship and to atone. So for Christians and our Jewish siblings, that is almost always to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land. And this was true back in the times of the Old Testament. Physically, that journey that they made to Jerusalem was rather difficult for them. It required them to leave their homes, their jobs, and to journey sometimes hundreds of miles on foot. Now, there are times where you and I are reluctant to make a 5, 10, 15-minute drive to church. So imagine how difficult a pilgrimage on foot to Jerusalem would be, especially in the ancient world. But this journey to Jerusalem was a means to strengthen one's faith. When the going got tough, when the motivation to finish or to make that journey at all began to wane, our ancient ancestors turned to the words of our psalmist. "Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord," they would sing. "Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy." This is a beautiful statement of faith. My friends, there is no shame in finding yourself in the depths, to find yourself experiencing a spiritual drowning. That is a near universal human experience, as old as the Old Testament itself. All of the great heroes of our faith have been there before. The psalmist, of course, has been in the depths. Father Abraham has been in the depths. Moses, Mary, Martha, Peter, the Apostle Paul. Sometimes, whether by our own doing or not, we find ourselves so distant from God that we can't even see the shoreline anymore. But the good news of this beautiful song of ascent is that while Psalm 30 may have been born out of the depths, it did not remain there. It ascended. It was lifted out of the depths. So this is not a message of despair, but rather one that is confidently filled with hope and with joy. Because no matter how far we've drifted or sank, the lifeguard is always on duty. All we have to do is to cry out for rescue. Amen.